The date is June 4th, 1942. The location is a vast expanse of ocean northwest of Midway Atoll, a tiny speck of coral and sand in the Central Pacific. On the bridge of the Japanese aircraft carrier Akagi, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stands surveying his fleet with quiet confidence. Around him, stretching across the horizon, sail three more carriers, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu. Together, these four vessels represent the most powerful naval strike force in the world. Their pilots are veterans of Pearl Harbor, the conquest of the Philippines, the raids on Darwin, and the domination of the Indian Ocean. They have never known defeat. In just a few hours, everything Nagumo knows about naval warfare will be turned upside down in a catastrophe so swift and complete that it will take his breath away. The morning has not been without problems, but nothing the Admiral cannot handle, or so he believes. Nagumo is a careful, methodical officer, promoted through seniority and political connections rather than through any particular brilliance in carrier operations. He is 55 years old, a torpedo specialist from an earlier era, and though he commanded the Pearl Harbor strike force 6 months earlier, he did so with considerable caution and reluctance. Unlike the aggressive, innovative air commanders around him, Nagumo represents the old guard of the Imperial Japanese Navy, a man more comfortable with battleships and traditional fleet actions than with the revolutionary new warfare being waged from carrier flight decks. This morning, his force has already struck Midway Island with over 100 aircraft, pounding the American installations there in preparation for an invasion. The attack went well enough, but the strike commander reported that a second strike would be necessary to fully suppress the island's defenses. This recommendation sets in motion a series of decisions that will prove fatal. Nagumo has held back a second wave of aircraft, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for use against any American ships that might appear. Naval intelligence has assured him that the U.S. Pacific Fleet is still back at Pearl Harbor, recovering from the devastating blow dealt to it 6 months earlier. But Nagumo is careful. He has kept 93 aircraft spotted on his flight decks, ready to launch against enemy vessels should they appear. When the strike commander requests a second attack on Midway, Nagumo makes his first fateful decision. He orders the reserve aircraft to be rearmed with fragmentation bombs and general-purpose ordnance suitable for attacking land targets. It is a sensible order, given the information he possesses. His crews immediately begin the laborious process of striking the torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs below to the magazines and bringing up the land attack weapons. The flight decks become scenes of controlled chaos as ordnance carts roll back and forth, as mechanics work frantically, as the minutes tick by. Then, at 7:28 in the morning, a scout plane radios a report that changes everything. The pilot reports sighting 10 enemy surface ships to the northeast, approximately 200 miles away. The message is brief and lacks crucial detail. Nagumo immediately orders the rearming process halted, but the damage is done. His flight decks are now cluttered with aircraft in various states of readiness, some armed for land attack, some partially rearmed, ordnance scattered about, fuel hoses running everywhere. He desperately needs to know if there is a carrier among those 10 enemy ships. If so, everything changes. If not, he can proceed with the second Midway strike. 20 agonizing minutes pass before the scout plane sends another message. The pilot now reports that the enemy force includes what appears to be a carrier. Nagumo's careful plans begin to unravel. He must strike that carrier immediately, before it can strike him. But his decks are in disarray. His first strike wave is returning from Midway low on fuel and ammunition, and his reserve aircraft are in the midst of a rearming evolution. He makes his second fateful decision. Recover the Midway strike force first, then prepare a proper attack with his full strength against the American carrier. It is a decision born of caution and doctrine, a decision that seems reasonable in the moment. It is also a decision that will cost him everything. While Nagumo's crews work frantically to clear the flight decks and recover the incoming aircraft, the American carriers Yorktown, Enterprise, and Hornet are closing the range. Their admiral, Raymond Spruance, is everything Nagumo is not. Aggressive, willing to take calculated risks, and blessed with intelligence information that gives him an enormous advantage. American codebreakers have penetrated the Japanese naval codes, and Spruance knows not only that the Japanese are coming to Midway, but also the approximate size and composition of their force. He knows he is outnumbered, but he also knows that surprise is worth more than numbers. He has launched his strike aircraft early, at extreme range, gambling that his aviators can reach the Japanese carriers while they are most vulnerable. The American attack develops piecemeal and badly. The first to arrive are the torpedo bombers, slow, obsolescent Douglas devastators flying low over the water. They are brave men in death traps. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet arrives first, just after 9:30 in the morning. 15 aircraft diving down to attack altitude, flying straight and level as they must to drop their torpedoes, presenting perfect targets to the Japanese Combat Air Patrol and the fleet's anti-aircraft guns. The Akagi's lookouts spot them first. Alarm bells sound across the fleet. Nagumo's carriers begin violent evasive maneuvers, turning sharply, increasing speed. Mitsubishi Zero fighters fall upon the slow American planes like wolves on sheep. The sky fills with fire and smoke and falling aircraft. Not a single torpedo from Torpedo Squadron 8 hits its target. Not a single one of its pilots survives. Ensign George Gay is the only survivor from the entire squadron, floating in the water amid the wreckage, watching the battle unfold from his life raft. It is a slaughter. Minutes later, Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise arrives, then Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown. They meet the same fate. The Zeros are everywhere, their pilots expert, their aircraft superior. The slow torpedo bombers fall one after another, splashing into the sea in great gouts of spray. Of 41 torpedo bombers launched from the 3 American carriers, only 6 will return. They score no hits. On the Akagi's bridge, Nagumo allows himself a moment of relief. The American attack has been completely defeated. His carriers are untouched. His combat air patrol has performed magnificently. Below him, on the flight deck, crews are still working to prepare the strike force against the American carriers. The returning Midway strike force has been recovered. The reserve aircraft are now finally being armed with the proper ordnance for attacking ships. Some of them are being moved into position for launch. In perhaps 30 minutes, perhaps 40, he will be ready to launch a devastating counterstrike. The Americans have shown their hand too early and wasted their strength. Victory is still within his grasp. But the torpedo bombers, dying in their dozens, have accomplished something their pilots will never know. By attacking at wave-top height, they have pulled the entire Japanese combat air patrol down to low altitude. The Zeros are low and slow, their pilots focused on finishing off the last of the torpedo bombers, their aircraft burning through their ammunition and fuel. And high above, unseen in the broken clouds, 3 squadrons of American dive bombers are approaching the Japanese fleet. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey has been searching for the Japanese carriers for over 2 hours, leading 33 Douglas Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise. He has flown to where the intelligence estimates placed the enemy fleet and found nothing but empty ocean. His fuel gauges are dropping toward the point of no return. He should turn back. Most of his pilots think he should turn back. But McCluskey sees a lone Japanese destroyer below, cutting a white wake through the blue water, heading northwest at high speed. It is the Arashi, racing to rejoin the main fleet after depth charging an American submarine. McCluskey makes a guess, a gamble, a decision based on instinct and hope. He turns to follow the destroyer's wake. At 10:22 in the morning, McCluskey's gamble pays off. Through a break in the clouds, his radioman gunner spots them, 4 Japanese carriers in a formation roughly 6 miles across, their flight decks crowded with aircraft, their wakes white against the blue sea. McCluskey does not hesitate. He pushes over into his attack, and 33 dive bombers follow him down. The altimeters unwind rapidly. 12,000 feet, 10,000 feet, 8,000 feet. The Akagi grows larger in his bomb sight. the rising sun insignia on her deck gleaming bright red. Her flight deck is packed with aircraft, many of them still being armed and fueled. Japanese sailors look up in horror at the American planes screaming down from the sky. At almost the same moment, by chance and fortune, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie arrives over the Japanese fleet with 17 Dauntlesses from Yorktown. The Americans have not coordinated their attack. They do not even know the other group is there. But by sheer accident, they have achieved perfect tactical timing. Two groups of dive bombers, 50 aircraft in total, all arriving at the same moment, from different directions, at high altitude, where the Japanese fighters cannot reach them in time. It is the nightmare scenario for any carrier, Admiral, and Nagumo is about to live through it. The next 5 minutes will change the course of the Pacific War. McCluskey assigns his squadrons their targets. The Kaga is closest. He leads one squadron against her while sending another toward the Akagi. Leslie's Yorktown planes independently select the Soryu. The Hiryu, some distance from the others, escapes notice for the moment. The dive bombers plunge down at speeds exceeding 250 miles per hour, their pilots fighting the G-forces, their bomb sights centered on the carriers below, their fingers tightening on the release triggers. On the Kaga, lookouts finally spot the American planes. There is no time to do anything but shout warnings. The carrier is in a vulnerable position, her deck crowded with 30 aircraft being armed and fueled for launch. Fuel hoses snake across the deck. Ordnance carts stand beside aircraft. Bombs and torpedoes are spotted on the deck, waiting to be loaded. It is a floating ammunition dump, and the American bombs are about to turn it into an inferno. The first bomb hits near the Kaga's bridge at approximately 10:24 in the morning. It is a 1,000-pound armor-piercing bomb, converted from an artillery shell, and it punches through the flight deck like a fist through paper. It detonates deep inside the ship, starting fires immediately. Seconds later, 3 more bombs hit in rapid succession. One strikes among the massed aircraft on the flight deck. The results are instantaneous and catastrophic. Aircraft explode, aviation fuel ignites, bombs and torpedoes begin to detonate in chain reactions. Within seconds, the Kaga's flight deck is a sea of fire. Her hangars below are even worse. The ship shudders with internal explosions as her own ordnance cooks off. Men are blown apart, incinerated, trapped in compartments filling with smoke and flames. The Kaga, pride of the Japanese carrier fleet, is transformed from a functioning warship into a blazing wreck in less than 60 seconds. Simultaneously, other dive bombers attack the Akagi, Nagumo's flagship. The first bomb misses. The second hits aft, near the flight deck elevators, detonating among the massed aircraft there. Like the Kaga, the Akagi erupts in flames. A massive explosion blows aircraft and men into the air. Fires spread instantly across the flight deck and into the hangars below. The ordnance waiting to be loaded aboard the strike aircraft begins exploding. Torpedo warheads detonate with tremendous force, blowing holes in the armored deck. Aviation fuel feeds the flames, creating an inferno that spreads faster than damage control parties can move. Within minutes, the fires are out of control. The ship's steering jams. She begins to circle helplessly, trailing smoke visible for 50 miles. On the Akagi's bridge, Nagumo and his staff stand stunned, unable to comprehend the catastrophe unfolding beneath their feet. One moment, victory was within their grasp. The next, their flagship is dying under them. Smoke pours through ventilation shafts into the bridge. The heat becomes unbearable. Communications fail. The Admiral and his staff are forced to evacuate, climbing down ladders through smoke and chaos, abandoning the ship's command center. They transfer by boat to the cruiser Nagara, from whose deck Nagumo will watch helplessly as his carrier force destroys itself. The Soryu, attacked by Leslie's Yorktown dive bombers, fares no better. 3 bombs strike her in rapid succession. The first hits amidships, blowing a massive hole in the flight deck. The second strikes near the forward elevator. The third hits among the massed aircraft being prepared for launch. The effects are identical to those on the Kaga and Akagi: instant fires, exploding ordnance, chain reactions of destruction. The Soryu's hangar deck becomes a crematorium, men trapped below pound on jammed hatches as flames roast them alive. The ship's captain, realizing his vessel is doomed within minutes of the attack, gives the order to abandon ship. Sailors leap into the ocean from a carrier that, 5 minutes earlier, was ready to launch a devastating strike against the American fleet. In 5 minutes, 3 Japanese fleet carriers have been reduced to burning hulks. 3 ships that represented years of construction, billions of yen in investment, and the cream of Japanese naval aviation are finished. The cargo will burn until evening, then sink beneath the waves. The Soryu will last only a few more hours before she too slips beneath the surface. The Akagi will burn through the night, kept afloat only by her strong construction, until Japanese destroyers finally torpedo her the next morning to prevent her capture. Of the 4 carriers Nagumo commanded that morning, only the Hiryu remains operational, and she is already being hunted. The catastrophe is so swift, so complete, that many participants will later struggle to believe their own memories. American pilots pulling out of their dives look back to see all 3 targets ablaze, flames shooting hundreds of feet into the air, explosions rippling across the decks. They can hardly believe their eyes. They expect to see flaming wreckage in the water, expect to be shot down by the combat air patrol, expect to die like the torpedo bomber crews. Instead, they have destroyed 3 carriers in 5 minutes, and most of them escape unharmed, racing back toward their own ships, with their radios crackling with excited reports of hits and fires and destruction. On the Nagara, Nagumo stands like a man who has been struck in the head. His careful plans, his methodical approach, his faith in Japanese training and equipment, all have been shattered in the time it takes to boil an egg. The attacking American dive bombers are already disappearing toward the horizon. His combat air patrol, still low on fuel and ammunition from decimating the torpedo bombers, is in no position to pursue. His 3 carriers burn like torches, sending pillars of smoke thousands of feet into the air. Only the Hiryu, several miles away from the others, remains operational. It is not enough. Nagumo knows it is not enough, but it is all he has. The Hiryu's commander, Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, is made of sterner stuff than Nagumo. He is a fighting admiral, aggressive and bold, and he immediately prepares to strike back with everything he has. Within an hour, he launches a strike of 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters against the American carriers. They find the Yorktown and hit her with 3 bombs, inflicting heavy damage. Later, Yamaguchi launches a second strike of 10 torpedo bombers that puts 2 torpedoes into the Yorktown, leaving her dead in the water. But these are pinpricks compared to the massive wound inflicted on the Japanese fleet, and the Hiryu's moment of survival is already running out. American search planes find the Hiryu in the early afternoon. Enterprise launches a final strike, 24 dive bombers that locate the last Japanese carrier at 5 o'clock in the evening. They attack out of the setting sun, and their bombs strike true. 4 hits turn the Hiryu into another blazing wreck. Yamaguchi refuses to abandon ship, choosing to go down with his carrier. He and the Hiryu's captain tie themselves to the bridge and ride the ship down when she sinks the following morning. In less than 12 hours, all 4 of Nagumo's carriers have been destroyed. Japanese naval aviation has suffered a wound from which it will never recover. But how did this happen? How did the most powerful carrier force in the world, commanded by veterans of 6 months of unbroken victory, end up at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean? The answer lies in a series of decisions, circumstances, and factors that came together in a perfect storm of disaster for the Japanese. First and foremost is intelligence. The Americans know the Japanese are coming. They know the plan. They know the approximate timing and location. This advantage cannot be overstated. While Nagumo believes he is achieving surprise, he is actually sailing into a trap. The American carriers are not at Pearl Harbor as Japanese intelligence believes. They are waiting north of Midway, positioned to ambush the Japanese fleet. This single fact undermines every assumption Nagumo makes. Second is the series of decisions Nagumo makes during the morning of June 4th. The choice to rearm his reserve strike force for a second attack on Midway is defensible, given what he knows. But it puts his carriers in a vulnerable state precisely when American aircraft arrive. The decision to recover the Midway strike force before launching against the American carriers is tactically sound in isolation. Carrier doctrine calls for massed strikes, not piecemeal attacks. But combined with the rearming evolution, it creates a window of vulnerability that the Americans exploit with devastating effect. Third is timing and luck. The American Indri attacks arrive in a sequence that seems almost choreographed, though it is actually accidental. The torpedo bombers attack first and are slaughtered, but they pull the combat air patrol down to sea level and scatter it across the sky. When the dive bombers arrive minutes later, they find the Japanese carriers with minimal high-altitude protection, with their decks crowded with armed and fueled aircraft, at the moment of maximum vulnerability. Had the torpedo bombers attacked 15 minutes earlier or later, had the dive bombers arrived before or after the torpedo attack, the results might have been very different. Fourth is the fundamental vulnerability of the aircraft carrier itself. These ships are enormous, fast, capable of projecting power across hundreds of miles. But they are also floating fuel tanks and ammunition dumps. When American bombs penetrate to the hangars and explode among massed aircraft, the resulting fires are almost impossible to control. The Japanese carriers lack the damage control capabilities of their American counterparts. They have fewer pumps, less compartmentalization, less effective firefighting equipment. Once major fires start, they spread rapidly and feed on the ship's own weapons and fuel. The very things that make carriers powerful also make them desperately vulnerable. Fifth is Japanese operational doctrine and training. The Imperial Japanese Navy has trained its pilots to elite standards. They are superbly skilled in offensive operations. But the focus on offense comes at the expense of defense. The Japanese carriers have relatively small combat air patrols. They lack effective radar. Their fighter direction is primitive compared to American systems. When the dive bombers appear overhead with little warning, the carriers have no effective defense. The Zeros are too low, too slow, too scattered to intercept. The anti-aircraft guns have almost no time to bear on targets plunging down at high speed from high altitude. Americans, meanwhile, benefit from aircraft designed with different priorities. The Douglas Dauntless dive bomber is not fast or glamorous. It is slower than Japanese dive bombers, carries a smaller bomb load, has less range, but it is rugged, stable, and equipped with an excellent bomb sight. Its pilots are well trained in dive bombing techniques. And on this day, with Japanese fighters out of position and anti-aircraft fire ineffective, the Dauntless proves to be the right weapon in the right place at the right time. The human element cannot be ignored. McCluskey's decision to follow the Arashi's wake is not based on intelligence or doctrine. It is based on instinct and determination. A less persistent commander would have turned back when the carriers were not where expected. McCluskey keeps searching, burning through his fuel reserves, trusting his gut. That decision leads him to the Japanese fleet at precisely the right moment. Similarly, the torpedo bomber crews who die attacking, at low level, show extraordinary courage. They know they are flying into certain death. They attack anyway, and in dying, they create the conditions for the dive bombers to succeed. On the Japanese side, Nagumo is out of his depth. He is a competent administrator, a capable torpedo specialist, but he lacks the aggressive instincts and carrier expertise the situation demands. Yamaguchi, commanding the 2nd Carrier Division, is more capable, but he is a subordinate and cannot override Nagumo's decisions. The Japanese command structure is rigid and hierarchical. Junior officers cannot question senior officers' decisions. This rigidity prevents the kind of rapid adaptation that the fluid carrier battle requires. The aftermath of Midway is profound and far-reaching. Japan loses not only 4 carriers, but also a large portion of her most experienced pilots and aircrew. The mechanics, the flight deck crews, the ordnance handlers, the the specialists who made the carrier force function, effectively, hundreds of them die in the fires or drown when the ships go down. This expertise cannot be quickly replaced. Japan will build new carriers, but she cannot quickly train new crews to the standards of those lost at Midway. The strategic balance in the Pacific shifts decisively. Before Midway, Japan held the initiative and could strike where she chose. After Midway, she is on the defensive. The myth of Japanese invincibility is shattered. American morale soars. The Battle of Midway does not end the war, but it marks the high water mark of Japanese expansion. From this point forward, Japan will be reacting to American moves rather than dictating the pace of events. For Nagumo personally, Midway is a catastrophe from which his reputation never recovers. He remains in command positions, but he is a broken man, haunted by the loss of his carriers. He will later command forces in the Marianas, and when American forces capture Saipan in July 1944, Nagumo will take his own life rather than face capture. He dies knowing that his name is forever linked to Japan's worst naval defeat. The Battle of Midway becomes a subject of endless study and analysis. Military historians dissect every decision, every action, every accident of timing. They debate whether Nagumo could have won if he had done things differently, whether the American victory was inevitable or the result of luck. The consensus is that both sides made mistakes, but the Americans were in position to exploit their opportunities, while the Japanese were not. Intelligence gave the Americans an enormous advantage. Courage and determination allowed them to capitalize on that advantage. Japanese vulnerabilities in doctrine, equipment, and leadership turned potential defeat into catastrophe. The 5 minutes from 10:22 to 10:27 on the morning of June 4, 1942, represent one of the most decisive periods in naval history. In those 5 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers are mortally wounded. In those 5 minutes, the course of the Pacific War changes. In those 5 minutes, Admiral Nagumo's world collapses. He never expected dive bombers to appear overhead at that precise moment. He never expected his carriers to be so vulnerable. He never expected American bombs to transform his powerful fleet into burning wreckage in less time than it takes to conduct a normal flight deck evolution. But war is full of the unexpected. Battle rewards the prepared, the aggressive, the flexible, and the lucky. On June 4, 1942, the Americans are all of these things. The Japanese are none of them. The result is a catastrophe that shocks the Japanese high command, elates the American public, and changes the strategic calculus of the entire Pacific theater. The images of those burning carriers haunt the survivors on both sides. American pilots describe columns of smoke rising thousands of feet into the tropical sky, visible for 70 miles or more. They describe Japanese sailors leaping into the ocean from flight decks engulfed in flames. They describe the awesome power of naval aviation when it strikes home against vulnerable targets. Japanese survivors describe the terror of being trapped below decks as fires spread, the horror of watching shipmates incinerated, the despair of abandoning ships that represented years of their lives, and the pride of the Imperial Navy. The Battle of Midway demonstrates that aircraft carriers, for all their power, are fragile instruments of war. They project enormous strength across vast distances, but they are also vulnerable to sudden catastrophic damage. The concentration of aviation fuel, ordnance, and aircraft on the flight deck and in the hangars creates a volatile mix that can explode into disaster if enemy bombs penetrate the defenses. The Japanese carriers at Midway are caught at the worst possible moment, with armed and fueled aircraft on deck, in the middle of complex operations, unable to launch or defend effectively. The result is predictable in hindsight, though it shocks everyone at the time. The battle also demonstrates the importance of intelligence in modern warfare. The American codebreakers who penetrate the Japanese naval codes provide Admiral Nimitz and Admiral Spruance with information that is worth more than a dozen battleships. Knowing the enemy's plan, knowing his strength, knowing his timing, allows the Americans to position their inferior forces for maximum effect. The Japanese, operating blind, make assumptions that prove fatally wrong. They assume surprise. They assume the American carriers are elsewhere. They assume their dominance of the previous 6 months will continue. All of these assumptions are shattered in 5 terrible minutes. Midway also illustrates the role of chance and accident in warfare. The dive bombers arrive at the perfect moment, largely by accident. McCluskey's decision to follow the Arashi is based on hunch, not intelligence. The timing that brings the torpedo bombers and dive bombers over the Japanese fleet in perfect sequence is coincidental, not coordinated. The fact that the Hairyu is separated from the other carriers and initially escapes destruction is an accident of formation geometry. War is not a chess game with perfect information and logical moves. It is chaos, confusion, accidents, and split-second decisions with enormous consequences. The courage of the men on both sides deserves recognition. The American torpedo bomber crews who fly into certain death, knowing they will not return, display extraordinary bravery. The Japanese sailors who fight fires and flooding aboard doomed ships, who stay at their posts even as the ships sink beneath them, show equal courage. The dive bomber pilots who push over into their attacks knowing they might be shot down at any moment, the fighter pilots on both sides who engage in swirling dogfights over the fleet, the damage control, parties who enter burning compartments to rescue trapped shipmates, all of them display the kind of courage that defines the best of military service. For the United States, Midway validates the decision to prioritize carriers over battleships in the Pacific War. The battleship admirals who dominate the pre-war Navy are proven wrong. The future belongs to carriers and aircraft, to long-range striking power, to the new form of naval warfare. The lessons learned at Midway about concentration of force, about defensive measures, about damage control, shape American carrier doctrine for the rest of the war and beyond. For Japan, Midway is a disaster that cannot be acknowledged publicly. The Japanese government hides the extent of the defeat from its own people. The survivors are quarantined and forbidden to speak about what happened. And the knowledge eats away at their confidence and their planning for the rest of the war. They have been beaten, badly, by an enemy they underestimated. They have lost irreplaceable assets in carriers and aircrew. They have learned that American industry and American determination are more formidable than they believed. The Battle of Midway stands as one of the decisive engagements of the Second World War, ranking alongside Stalingrad and D-Day in its strategic significance. The 5 minutes when the dive bombers struck represents the hinge of the battle, the moment when Japanese victory turned into Japanese defeat, when the course of the Pacific War changed direction. Admiral Nagumo never expected those dive bombers. He never expected his carriers to burn. He never expected to lose everything in 5 minutes. But war is full of the unexpected, and on that June morning in 1942, the unexpected destroyed his fleet and changed the course of history. The legacy of those 5 minutes echoes through the 22 decades that follow. Military academies study Midway as an example of how battles can turn on small decisions and accidents of timing. Naval officers learn about the vulnerability of carriers and the importance of defensive measures. Intelligence agencies point to Midway as validation of the crucial role of signals intelligence in modern warfare. Historians debate the what-ifs and might-have-beens, the alternative scenarios where different decisions lead to different outcomes. But in the end, what happened, happened. 4 Japanese carriers burned and sank. Hundreds of skilled aircrew and sailors died. The Japanese advance stopped. The Americans gained the initiative. And Admiral Nagumo, standing on the deck of the cruiser Nagara, watched his flagship burn and knew that his career, his reputation, and his fleet were finished. He never expected dive bombers to appear overhead at that precise moment. He never expected his carriers to be so vulnerable. He never expected to lose everything in 5 minutes. But that is exactly what happened on the morning of June 4, 1942, in the waters northwest of Midway Atoll, when the course of the Pacific War changed forever in the time it takes to hard-boil an egg.